Hello everyone, it's pretty much 5 o'clock here on the eastern seaboard of Australia. So welcome to you all to this webinar entitled The Importance of Mental Toughness Now and Beyond the COVID-19 Crisis. And we're featuring today one of the leading global experts on mental toughness in Doug Strycharczyk, who's also CEO of AQR International, two of the developers of the MTQ psychometric concept and measure. My name's Paul Lyons. I'm from Mental Toughness Partners, and we're one of the AQR local partners. And I'm joined on the panel this evening by two prominent local mental toughness practitioners. Firstly, Leah Zalums. Hi, Leah. Do you want to introduce yourself and say hello?
Yes, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Doug. And yeah, as Paul said, I'm Leah Zalums, and I'm based in Sydney. I am an executive team leader development coach, specifically in the science and technology market. And a lot of my coaching, mentoring, training is centered around the mental toughness model. So really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. And also joined by Steve Asimoudis, Principal Sage Learning and Development. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Paul. And I'm based here in Melbourne and came across MTQ around 5 years ago. My background was undergraduate, postgraduate psychology, 17 odd years in the pharmaceutical industry, in sales and sales management, and then in training and L&D. So I know a lot of the participants today may have come from pharmaceutical industry or organisational backgrounds. So we're looking forward to Doug taking us around the 4 season subscales. So back over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Steve. And Claudine Rowlands from AQR is managing the call, although she's not visible right now. And we'll be able to answer all of your questions, or hopefully most of them, at about 5:45. So please send them through the chat panel, and we'll answer them as we can. So without further ado, welcome to Doug, calling in from AQR headquarters in the UK, in Chester in the UK. Hi, Doug. How are you?
I'm very well, Paul, and greetings to everybody in Australia, especially my colleagues on the panel who have got at least as much experience now of mental toughness as I have.
Well, I'm not quite sure about that, but perhaps all of us combined, we may get close. But thanks, Doug. I'm going to kick off with a question because we're really interested to understand, in the context of COVID-19, the importance of self-awareness and how a mentally sensitive person and a mentally tough person may think and behave in each of the 8 subscales of the 4 C's framework, which I think is going to magically appear on the screen behind you any moment.
Right. So can everybody see the pizza image?
Not yet. No. Oh, yes, we can. In front of you. Yeah, we can.
Yeah. It should be on screen. So, COVID-19, I think it's useful perhaps to put it into perspective a little. People think it's a once in 100 years event, and as far as viral infections are concerned, it is. But actually, what we're beginning to see is that people are beginning to put it into some sort of perspective. After all, in Australia, you've had fires, and you've had a lot of things happening that have affected a lot of people and created a lot of trauma. You've also had floods. We've had floods here that have affected people. And you don't have to go back terribly far to, say, an event like 9/11, in New York. And in some ways, the impact of those events were at least as dramatic as what's happening now. But what we understand about mental toughness, and we have a nice formal definition, but the easiest way of understanding it is mental toughness is describing our mental responses to events. So when something happens, it's not our behavior that we're concerned with here, it's what's happening in our head. What are we thinking about? And that's important because we know that our thoughts have a big impact on our behavior. And of course, it's behavior that we see. This mad rush for toilet rolls is a result of something that has happened inside somebody's head. They panicked and they thought, I'm going to run out of toilet rolls, so they rush out and buy toilet rolls. But actually, there isn't a shortage of toilet rolls. it's what they imagine, it's what's happening in their head. So when you've got something like COVID-19, which is a big event, I'm not trying to downplay it at all, it's a big event for a lot of people. And so what we're concerned with here is, firstly, the immediate mental response to what's happening, and then to begin to try and think about what are the long-term consequences. Is this going to affect our mental responses in the medium and the long term? And we think it may well do. So first of all, we have the pizza image there. It's based on Peter Clough's 4 C's framework, which talks about control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. But actually the meat of the concept lies in the 8 factors that you see described there. So I'm just going to go very quickly around those, talking about how somebody might or might not be responding at this point in time. And the first one is, we'll start up in the top left-hand corner, we'll talk about life control. And this is where the sense of can-do sits. This is where people have this sense of, I can control enough of my life and circumstances to achieve what I want, or to be able to survive or even thrive. The interesting thing is, right at the moment, we are getting inundated with calls from businesses, coaches, and individuals. And they are falling into 3 groups. The first group are what I would call senior leaders, senior and middle leaders, who are suddenly finding they're beginning to struggle a little. And one of the things that we see is, most of the time, in normal times, whatever normal is, most people can feel generally in control of their life, their circumstances, their workplace, and so on. But if you've got an average level of control, that probably works for you most of the time. If you get subjected to an extreme pressure and that pressure is sustained, your sense of control begins to change. You begin to think, I'm not in control. I can't control this. Things are happening all around me and I am not able to influence them, and this is impacting on the way I can achieve things. So when you look at life control, what we think is beginning to happen is that some people are beginning to feel, I can't control this. And if I can't control this, we know, the research tells us, we get stressed, get more and more stressed. But there are some, obviously, the more mentally tough on this scale, who feel, no, well, I can't control everything, but there are bits that I can control, and I can manage those bits, and those bits will help me to get through this. So that's an example of the impacts of, say, life control, the life control element of mental toughness. But you've got a similar impact with emotional control, because in normal circumstances, we've actually got an example that we can show a little later of a senior leader in an organization who's generally mentally tough across all the scales, but on one factor, he's got a degree of mental sensitivity, and that's the emotional control factor. In normal times, he and his team are able to live with that. He might have the odd outburst, but the team is pretty good at helping him to, recover from it or deal with it. He's now working on his own from home. He's separated from his team, and he's beginning to struggle because he has his outbursts, his emotions begin to take over, and he finds he can't get out of it. So again, what we'll see here is people who've got high levels of emotional control will be able to keep that. In Britain, we call it a stiff upper lip or whatever. In the more mentally sensitive, they're going to struggle. I think we're also going to see an impact on the commitment construct, because what we're also beginning to see is when we look at goal orientation, most of the time, somebody who's mentally tough on goal orientation is somebody who likes to set goals for themselves and likes working to goals. Well, we've now been in 3 or 4 months of, I would say, extreme uncertainty. Nobody can tell us when this is going to end. Nobody can tell us whether there's a cure. Nobody can tell us when we can come back and work on the, at least in similar circumstances to those that we were working in 2019. And so for people who've got a moderate level of goal orientation, that can be quite a struggle because they can't set goals. And people who've got high levels of goal orientation, they might be able to set some goals for themselves. So again, what we think is beginning to happen is a degree of polarization. And the same is going to apply to each of those factors. Risk orientation is very appropriate to the current situation because risk orientation is about how do I approach a major change? How do I approach a major setback? And this is what we're experiencing at the moment. So some people are looking at that and saying, well, that's it. That's the end. I can't see how we can work our way through this. I don't like it. Whereas others are saying, well, actually, I can see the opportunity in this. We've got a very good example here. Well, I think in every town in Britain and probably in Australia, one of the first group of businesses to be shut down in the COVID-19 crisis were bars, restaurants and cafes. And a lot of owners simply shut up and went home. Some realized, well, I've still got a kitchen, I've still got staff, people still want to eat. I'm going to set up a meal delivery service. And they're thriving, they're prospering. So those people who are, I would hazard a guess and say, are probably more mentally tough, they've seen and grasped the opportunity. Others haven't seen the opportunity, they've simply gone home and they're battening down the hatches and seeing if they can get through this. And then if you look at learning orientation, you're going to get a very similar effect because as we go through this crisis, there are lots and lots of things happening. And we know that some people will learn from what's happening and work out how to sort of survive and prosper. Others will simply shut down and say, I don't like this. I'm going to close my eyes until it's all over. And they're not really learning to adapt. And I think learning orientation is very, very important because one of the things that's, one of the positives you can say about a crisis like this, it's one of the best learning opportunities we have. We are going to experience crises all our lives. I was born in 1949. I have watched the Cuban Missile Crisis. I've watched the the oil crisis. In Britain, we had the ERM crisis when everybody suddenly went from moderately well off to incredibly poor. We have seen crises occur throughout our lives, and at an individual level, we have crises. It's very easy to be very fixated on what's happening with people who get COVID-19, but whilst all of this is going on, there are people having road accidents, families getting decimated and so on. This is an opportunity for us to learn how to deal with the big setbacks in life. Some of us can do it, some of us don't. Those who don't will simply come out of this perhaps shell-shocked. Then, of course, it's not going to be difficult to understand that if you can't do anything about your situation and it's all out of control, it's going to impact on your confidence and abilities for some people. Some will obviously think, right, I've got the ability to do that, or they'll even say, I think I need to acquire some new abilities. And they will use this time period purposefully. They'll say, well, there was something I couldn't do. Here's my opportunity to learn how to do it. I'm going to build my abilities and build my confidence and abilities. Others will just say, I have no idea how to deal with this. This is beyond my capability. That's it. So that's a very quick skirt round the mental toughness framework. Quick, that took about 10, 12 minutes. But that's giving you a flavour of how the 8 factors and how the mental toughness concept can give us an insight into what is likely to be happening inside the heads of a lot of people. And there's going to be a number of consequences of that. It's not the only factor. Obviously, somebody who has got very good social support, family support, and maybe have a very supportive employer may well be able to achieve a bit more. The mental toughness may be protected, the mental toughness may be developed. Others who haven't got those sort of things might feel they're drowning. So other factors are also important, but what we know is our mental responses are going to determine an awful lot of how we respond to the current situation, and a great deal of what our future responses are going to be like, how we're going to behave when all of this is over. Hopefully it will be over.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Doug. That was yeah, an extraordinary, you know, round robin there, and certainly the polarization aspect I picked up on that you mentioned. And again, depending on where we are on this scale of 0 to 10 in each of these 8 factors under normal conditions, what happens in these higher than normal stress conditions. So I'm just wondering if you could speak, and I think what you're also bringing in is the inner world reactivity and the way that we respond to things, and our external world conditions. So there is a lot of factors at play, but I think one of the things certainly that I'm seeing is that the mental health, mental sensitivity, mental toughness spectrum, and where that sits in relation to mental health from a well-being standpoint, and those people who are prone to experience greater mental health issues under these extraordinary stressful times that we have right now. Just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, we're fortunate, Leah. It's a really good point, and there are 2 things that we'll throw into the mix here. One is we are very fortunate that one of the leading researchers in the area of mental health is the Adolescent Mental Health Research Unit at the University of Basel. That's in Switzerland. And they have carried out a lot of research on mental toughness and its relationship with mental health. I mean, for instance, they're the people who identified that mentally tough and mentally sensitive people experience anxiety in the same way, and they experience it equally, but mentally tough people deal with anxiety, mentally sensitive people tend not to. The same's true for depression. There's a recent study, very recent study from Costas Papageorgiou in the Queen's University Belfast, which shows there's a correlation between mental sensitivity and suicidality. So we know that there are links, but at the University of Basel, they carried out about 3-4 years ago a really interesting study that has got applications now. They looked at students on the final year of a 3-year degree program. There was quite a large number. I can't remember whether it was 600 or 800. And broadly, half were mentally sensitive, half were mentally tough. Now, they simply wanted to understand what was the impact of the pressure of the final year. Now, everybody knows that that is the big pressure year. You know, you've been there for 2 years and now suddenly you're under a lot of pressure. You've got to get good exam results. You've got to get good assignment results, because in 9 months' time, you're going to leave here and you've either wasted your 3 years or you've optimized your 3 years. And we know that, you know, student suicidality is a factor here. And what they did is they assessed this big group of students at the start of the final year, and then they assessed them at the end. They didn't do anything in between times because they simply wanted to see what was happening. And as expected, they found that the more mentally tough achieved better results than the more mentally sensitive. But what they also found, and this is really interesting, is that the mentally tough became more mentally tough and the mentally sensitive became more mentally sensitive. So this is why we think in times of high pressure, you see a flattening of the normal distribution curve and you see a degree of polarization. Now, a lot of those impacts are fairly short-term impacts. What we're in here is we are now in a situation where, certainly in the UK, lockdown started in January, we're in February, we will probably continue for another 2 or 3 months. Now, any of us who are involved in people development know that we often talk about developing habits and developing new habits, and habits develop over time. So if you look at the little example I gave before on, 9/11, that was short and sharp, that happened, but it was over within a couple of days. And people responded, but then people went back to their pre-9/11 behavior because there wasn't a time to embed new habits and new behaviors. What we're seeing here is, I think we will see new behaviors emerge, new cultural norms, new behavioral norms emerge. Mental toughness might not change, but we'll certainly begin to behave in a different way. Now, as you know, Leah, and I think a lot of people know, we work very closely with Peter Clough, Professor Peter Clough. And one of the sort of, again, looking for the positives in all of this, is we realize we've got the opportunity to do a major study of our own. So what we are going to be doing, what we are actually doing, we've just started, is we're going to people who completed the mental toughness questionnaire in 2019 and asking for volunteers to complete the same questionnaire in 2020 now. So these are people who will have experienced COVID-19 and all its implications for several months. We want to see what has been the impact of mental toughness. And we have a hypothesis. We shouldn't say what the outcome will be until we've looked at the data. But the hypothesis is we're going to see a similar result to the result that was achieved at the University of Basel. We will see polarization. The more mentally sensitive becoming more mentally sensitive, the mentally tough becoming more mentally tough.
Yes, thank you, Doug. And that will be interesting to see, because again, what's the impact of all these externals on how we're responding and how we're thinking and the meaning we're making of things. And I guess, with the polarization, are you attributing that to a greater level of self-awareness, or is that happening, because people are, buttoning down the hatches, as it were, in their, what they're familiar with, what their natural unconscious go-to is?
Well, that's a really good question, because I think it's central to this, but it's also central to everything we do in around the mental toughness concept. I don't think it is self-awareness. I don't think people are particularly self-aware about the mental toughness or mental sensitivity. A mentally tough individual simply is aware that they've got a quality that enables them to survive. But then they don't think in terms of the 8 factors. They don't say, well, I've got great life control. I've got a higher than average level of emotional control. They don't think like that. They just know that when something happens, something kicks in and they can deal with it. And the same is true, and it's probably more relevant for the mentally sensitive. When something happens that's adverse for a mentally sensitive individual, they simply stop. They just think, I can't do this. But they're not thinking in terms of these 8 factors. They're not thinking, I'm letting my emotions run away with me, or achievement orientation. If I just made a little bit more effort here, I could get through this. They're not thinking like that. And so I think the notion of self-awareness is critically important here. The more that we can create self-awareness, the more people can understand what it is about what's going on inside them that either holds them back or helps them to prosper. If you can do that, then you're getting towards the holy grail of development. You're getting towards being able to select and target interventions to a real and precise need. We still throw things at people, throw tools and techniques at people. We still see fads developing. Everybody should do this, everybody should do that. And the reality is, a lot of those tools and techniques work, but they don't all work for all people. Here we've got the opportunity to understand why some work for some people and why others work for others. If we can get to that level of self-awareness, I think we would have a much better response to crises and to, you know, all of these kind of situations.
Yeah, and I think that was definitely one of the big takeaways from the mental toughness conference you put on last year in June, where you're bringing together practitioners and the researchers so that we can cross-pollinate our experiences and the research to direct this far more effectively and provide evidence-based interventions, as you say, that can be more targeted.
Yeah.
So, you know, thank you for all your support and continued investment in research into this. It's really,
well, when you attended that conference, I had with me one of my other colleagues, Dr. John Perry. And John has more recently been introducing something into understanding this that I think is quite important. He's pointing out that if the mentally tough have got this sort of, let's put a magic quality, then if we are genuinely to try and help everybody to not only survive but to prosper, then there is actually a case for the mentally tough becoming part of the environment that helps the mentally sensitive to survive. In other words, if you've got mental toughness and you are flying through life, don't just do it for yourself, try to do it for some other people as well. There are other people around who aren't going to deal with events as well as you. Help them, show them how.
Thank you, Doug, and I think that's a great segue into Steve's questions for you as well. And that's exactly where I have landed as someone who has been always on that drive and high performance, driven for high performance. And now I am totally committed to working with those who, you know, have more challenges, and how do we you know, embrace the mental sensitivity where the creativity and the intuition and all that wonderful innovation sits there. We want to embrace that and together link arms and create this new world order, as it were. So I'm personally very excited to be part of where this is all going. So thank you again.
No, thank you, Leah.
Doug, I'm going to get you to go to the your third slide, because I think people are going to be interested in that, and those of us that are accredited with, you know, other psychometric personality profiles and so on. I think your third slide shows the links between you know, neuroticism, you know, or emotionality, depending on the profile that you're using. And so if you want to just talk us through that, I think, yeah, there's some fascinating links that you've found there between neuroticism or emotionality. So increased or high neuroticism and links between, you know, negative effects on emotional control and those sorts of things. So talk us through some of the links that you're finding there on that slide.
Well, just to give a little bit of background, I mentioned him earlier, Dr. Kostas Papageorgiou, who is fast becoming academically the new kid on the block. He's doing some really remarkable things. And he has started a line of research that is going to impact on our understanding of the way interventions, tools and techniques work. And to start, he decided to look at the relationship between the mental toughness concept, a behavioral personality model, and for obvious reasons he selected the Big Five personality model, which is the most reliable and the most widely used in the world. He also looked at stress, and he's got a particular interest in something called the dark triad, which people will know as narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. There isn't actually a concept that can be described as the dark triad, but these three are traits that we can recognize. And commonly, people think that as you go up an organization, you tend to demonstrate more and more of these tendencies. And sometimes, well, most people assume there are negative consequences of these. So what he did is he got a large number of people to complete the mental toughness questionnaire, to complete a Big Five personality measure, a dark triad measure, and a stress measure. And he programmed his computer to identify the links between the core constructs. And what you see in front of you is a network which describes pictorially those links. So you see the mental toughness constructs are highlighted in red, and you can see challenge, commitment, confidence, and control. The Big Five measure are highlighted in purple. I hope it comes over as purple. So you've got openness to experience, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, and neuroticism. In the bottom right-hand corner, you've got the stress measure. So that's simply an assessment of how stressed you are. And then in green, you've got the three elements of the so-called dark triad. What he found, or what the research found, is they are connected. And they're connected in interesting ways. And you can see a lot of connection lines. The thickness of the line represents how strong that connection is between the particular constructs. So if you look at commitment, you can see it is very closely linked to the behavior conscientiousness. So our goal orientation and our achievement orientation is to some degree the source of our conscientiousness. And that's what we'd expect. We can see that in other areas there are very low connections. So commitment isn't a great factor in agreeableness. The colour of the line represents whether it's a positive relationship or an inverse relationship. So what we can see here is that if you look at challenge, it's very closely linked to openness to experience. It's what we'd expect. Commitment to conscientiousness. It's what we'd expect. Control, inversely related to neuroticism. Again, pretty much what you expect. And confidence, very closely linked to extroversion. Again, what you'd expect. We've always known that agreeableness doesn't always sit happily with within the Big Five framework, and it just seems to sit there. It's outside of all of this, but we can see very close links between mental toughness constructs and 4 of the Big Five constructs. Well, there are 2 interesting things here. I'll touch upon one, and it's moderately disruptive and controversial. We look at narcissism, and this has now been supported by 5 papers. What this is saying is that confidence is very closely related to narcissism, as is extroversion. And what this is also indicating is that narcissism isn't necessarily a negative quality. After all, if at its core, narcissism is simply, I think I'm great. What people are worried about are narcissists who say, I think I'm great, and I think you're useless or inferior, and I'll treat you that way. But what Costas' research is showing is that a mentally tough narcissist doesn't demonstrate, as a rule, generally, those maladaptive tendencies. So that's an interesting little piece of work, and it's demonstrating how the mental toughness concept is beginning to be useful to help us rethink some ideas that we've been familiar with or using for some time, but perhaps not fully or properly understood. But coming back to perhaps the fundamentally more important picture, this is the average network for the group of 800 people who participated in the study. So what he found was that when he looked at the individual networks for all 800 people, they were all unique. They were all different. Now that is very significant, because what he began to understand, or what he's begun to understand, is if each person has a unique network, and just imagine for a minute that this is somebody's unique network, and you want to develop, say, their confidence, what you might do is you might introduce a tool or a technique that will target confidence, but because of these connections, it might well also develop their extroversion, might develop narcissism, and it might adversely impact on their neuroticism, because this is an inverse relationship. And it might even have some impact on challenge. In other words, when we're developing people, we know two things. One is we know that some tools work, but other tools don't. Or sometimes we can use the same tool or approach with a person and it doesn't work with the next person. And we stand there scratching our heads and saying, well, I'm not sure why that's happened. What Costas is suggesting, and it sounds plausible, is that each one of us has a unique network, and whether an approach works for an individual depends on the nature and shape of their network. So that is, again, kind of a major breakthrough, because what he's using is the mental toughness framework to begin to understand why some tools work for some and some tools work for others. But he's also beginning to show here that perhaps we have the explanation for why when we introduce an approach or a tool or a technique to somebody, yes, we get the impact we were looking for, but we can sometimes get an unintended impact or an unintended consequence. So, you know, again, going back to this illustration, we've targeted confidence, but suddenly this person is becoming more narcissistic. Now, we didn't intend to do that, but it's a byproduct of their particular network. So, Steve, this is quite a big breakthrough, and in terms of the focus of research generally, it's now moving away from understanding the 4Cs framework and the 8 factors. We will come back to that, and we're always looking at how it can be improved. But that's what we've been doing for the past 18 years. We've been refining it, improving it. We think we've got it to a reasonable state. It's not perfect, never will be, and somebody will come along and add something to it, I'm sure, in the future and make it even better. To make it into a complete and practical concept, which is what we practitioners are after, is we need to understand how this connects with interventions. So this is quite an important development, because this is showing us where we might usefully explore the relationship between assessing somebody's mental toughness and developing their mental toughness, and how can we do that more effectively. But it seems that the underlying message is all development, whether it's training or coaching, has to be individualized. You know, the day of one-size-fits-all training, especially for things like soft skills training, has got to be in the past. By throwing stuff at large groups of people, we know some of it sticks and a lot of it doesn't. Here we've got the ability to understand how to make it stick for everyone.
I'm going to hit you with a future focused question, Doug, and you know, it seems that restrictions are starting to ease and we're potentially going to come out of isolation. And Dan Pink wrote the book To Sell is Human a number of years ago, and I think, you know, selling and building relationships will be important, have been important during this isolation. So tell us a bit about how, crystal ball, tell us a bit about how you see this playing out. Will those high in confidence in abilities thrive? Who might thrive, you know, post COVID-19?
Well, I guess my crystal ball is going to be coloured by the fact that I am an optimist, and there's reasons for my optimism. As I said earlier, I've lived through an awful lot of crises. I was born in 1949, which is not very long after the Second World War. I remember bomb sites, wrecked buildings and things like that. But within 10 years, even a society that had been devastated in that way, and we haven't got wrecked houses or anything like that at the moment, has managed to recover. So generally, we have the capacity to recover, and if enough of us learn from our experience, not only do we recover, but we generally take 1 or 2 steps to be better than we were before. But it's not going to be a comfortable journey for many people, because again, if we understand this notion of mental sensitivity and mental toughness, the mentally sensitive are going to really feel the pain. And we can see that, if you look at other dramatic crises, for instance, there are areas in Britain which were dependent on 1 or 2 industries like coal or steel or something like that. And when those industries disappeared, whole areas became devastated. Those areas, even in a prosperous Britain, have never really recovered. So, and it's very difficult to help them to recover. So there is a challenge about making sure that we bring everybody with us. And of course, if you can help and show the mentally sensitive how to recover as well as the mentally tough, you're going to get a faster recovery, and you're going to get a better response, a quicker response. And people are talking about a bounce back. I'm not sure there will be the kind of bounce back that people are talking about, but there is a general determination to recover. But what we're also seeing here in the UK and elsewhere, I mean, in the States, unemployment rates are rising dramatically. Cash flow is an issue for businesses. So even if a business is poised to recover and to start a business again, it might not always have the resources to be able to rehire enough people to get going. People might have learned some interesting behaviors. They might, I saw yesterday that savings rates are rising dramatically. So people, where they have money, are beginning to hoard it, because they're beginning to realize they might need it for a long time, and they might need it for yet another rainy day. And yet a lot of the predictions of recovery are based on the notion that the minute that the lid's off everything, people are going to rush out, fill restaurants, rush into shops, buy everything that's on the shelves and so on, and the economy will get going again. I'm not sure it's going to be quite like that. And I think we've still got to evaluate a lot, the crystal ball gazing. I could be completely wrong, but this is how I think it will pan out. And I do come back to the thing that we spoke about with Leah earlier, that we will have for a while a kind of have not and a have society. The mentally sensitive will be in one camp and the mentally tough will be in the other. And initially bringing them together and getting to work collaboratively together will be a challenge, because the mentally tough will almost are likely to become very focused on what they need to do. They won't necessarily always think about engaging everybody else around them. That's sometimes one of the characteristics of a mentally tough person. It can sometimes be an upside, but it can sometimes be a downside. So I do see recovery, and I do see a positive future, but how that's going to pan out exactly, I don't know.
Thanks very much for that, Doug. Some really exciting research going on, and then, as you just mentioned, the challenges that the mentally sensitive have. And we've had some really good questions coming through, and please keep them coming. I'm going to try and batch them together. There was a question here from Joe Pollard, who was talking about in what ways can mentally sensitive people be useful or constructive in these current times or circumstances. And I think also Lisa Prescott, you echoed that question as well. So I'm wondering, Doug, whether you can talk a little bit more about the advantages of being mentally sensitive in these times.
Well, the mentally sensitive do have potential advantages, but as we discussed with Leah, it rests entirely on being self-aware. If they aren't self-aware about some of the characteristics of mental sensitivity, you won't get the advantages. So again, being able to assess and show somebody how, what their mental sensitivity looks like, and where the potential potential advantages might lie is going to be critically important. I guess the two most important characteristics that they can bring to the party, one is we know that mentally sensitive individuals tend to be creative in a different way to mentally tough people. Now, in order to fuel the recovery and sort of move to the next phase, we may well need a lot of new ideas. The old order in a lot of things is going to disappear. So we can't just rely upon one kind of creativity. We might need more than one kind of creativity. So to harness the insights of the mentally sensitive and their ideas, their responses, is going to be quite important. It's going to be important anyway, because there's no point introducing new strategies and new plans and new ways of doing things if the mentally sensitive don't buy into it. The other thing is that the mentally sensitive do have a better awareness of overload than do the mentally tough. And there's going to be a big requirement now to make a big effort. And of course, one of the consequences of making a big effort is burnout. And but you need to listen to the mentally sensitive, because the mentally sensitive will be aware of work overload long before a mentally tough person will. In fact, people with very high levels of mental toughness don't recognize the warning signs of burnout. So these are two of the ways in which they can do it. But I think the most important thing is mentally sensitive at any time can account for 30 to 40% of our population. That's big enough to make a difference. So we do need to listen to their perspective, and we need to take their concerns into account. So we can't move forward with only half of the population. We need everybody here.
Thanks, Doug. You touched on there, and another question actually from Joe is it possible to be mentally tough and still creative or innovative? And I think you touched on it's just a different kind of creativity, but wondering if you can expand on that for Joe and myself as well. It's a really good question.
Yeah, it's a very general trend. And Pete, again, this is some work that Peter Clough's been doing. What we find is that the mentally tough tend to be, I'm just trying to remember the term now, when they're creative with other people, they tend to hold to their own views, divergent. The mentally sensitive tend to be convergent. However, the mentally sensitive will often see events from quite a different perspective to the mentally tough. And Peter will often use this little example. If you look at two famous Dutch artists, Van Gogh and Vermeer. One, Van Gogh, we obviously haven't got him to complete the mental toughness questionnaire. If we look at the characteristics of a mentally sensitive individual, he probably ticks all the boxes. And yet his style of art was completely different to everybody else at that time. So much so that he was derided. So much so that he couldn't sell his paintings. He used to have to give his paintings away and trade it for food. And he bemoaned that he wasn't recognized and wasn't successful. And everybody knows the famous story of, in desperation, he eventually cut his ear off. Vermeer, on the other hand, when you look at his characteristics, he ticks out the boxes of all the mentally tough. But his paintings are much more conventional. They're much more precise. They're much more logical, if you like. And he was a huge success in his lifetime. He became incredibly wealthy. And these are two people who were both Dutch artists, not exactly the same period of time, but they demonstrate the difference between mental sensitivity and mental toughness. But, you know, we have to temper that by saying not every mentally sensitive person is creative in the way that Van Gogh is, and not every mentally tough person is creative in the way that Vermeer is. These are statistical observations. So they talk about trends and likelihoods, not certainties. But they are there.
Excellent. Thanks, Doug. I've got a couple of people have asked the same question, really. Glenn Behenna and Robert Rossano, just wondering if there are any trends between or any trends around age and mental toughness. So do you become mentally tougher or more mentally sensitive as you age?
Yes, there is a piece of research that was carried out. As you know, when people complete the mental toughness questionnaire, they often give us additional pieces of information, like what level in the organization they work at, age, and one or two other, gender. And Dr. David Marchant and Peter Clough accessed our database, extracted all this information, and they identified 4,500 people between the ages of 18 and 65 for whom we had clean data. And what we found was very, very slowly and gradually over that time, mental toughness scores increased. Now that makes sense. That's on average. That does make sense because we know that part of our mental toughness is genetic and part of it is experiential. It's based on learning from our experiences as we go through life. Obviously, the older we get, we have more experiences, and on average, we learn from those experiences. So as we get through life, we begin to deal with events a little bit better. However, that's an average. So that's an interesting observation. That's not necessarily true about every individual. There will be some individuals who become more mentally sensitive over time. They might start as mentally tough, but their reaction to events might be such that it creates mental sensitivity, and vice versa. You might have people who are comparatively mentally sensitive, but for one reason or another, maybe they had a great coach who showed them how to reflect on events, they suddenly become much more mentally tough. But on average, there is a very slow increase in mental toughness over time. But we don't know yet what happens past 65. And that might be something that's of interest in the future, because we do have a growing elderly population.
Thanks, Doug. And at the other end of the scale, a comment here from Elaine Silver, who's commenting that she sees enormous mental sensitivity and increased depression, anxiety, and suicides amongst the young. Wants to find ways that she can reach out and support them. And I'm wondering whether that's something that's come up in your research and case studies around mental sensitivity in the young, and whether there's been any findings out of that, either anecdotal or preferably evidence-based.
Well, all of if anybody who's really interested, there are now, I can't remember, 10 or 12 peer-reviewed pieces of research on this very area from the University of Basel. That research unit is an adolescent mental health research unit. And what they have found is, as I mentioned earlier, that everybody gets anxious, but the mentally tough deal better with anxiety. Everybody gets depressed, but the mentally tough deal better with depression. They have one really interesting study which shows that the more mentally tough sleep better, they go to sleep more quickly and sleep more soundly. They get a better night's sleep than the mentally sensitive. And we think that's probably correlated or related to another piece of research, and that's on directed forgetting. There's another piece of research that shows when something adverse happens, the mentally tough appear to have the ability to put it to one side, almost stick it in a box in the head and put a lid on it and move on and not allow it to derail them. The mentally sensitive can't do that. It runs round and round inside their head, and they can't get it out of their head. So if you think about it in terms of going to sleep at the end of a day where something untoward has happened, a mentally tough person is going to be able to say, right, that's it, that was today, I'm going to sleep, tomorrow's a new day. A mentally sensitive person isn't going to be able to do that. They'll dwell on it and they won't be able to get off to sleep because it'll be gnawing away in their head. So there's an awful lot of research on that, and Costas, of course, has added to that with his suicidality studies, which are on students in higher education, which is a big growing issue. The suicide rate in student populations is rising dramatically. Why that's the case? Well, understanding the mental toughness and mental sensitivity is one part of the equation, but there's going to be others. It's like we're now bringing people into universities and colleges that would never in the past have gone to a university or a college. So are they actually ready to go and, you know, experience that kind of life? We don't know. We're bringing an awful lot of people into situations without always understanding the implication of putting them into that situation. So for instance, in Britain, Tony Blair declared that 50% of young people should go to college or into further or higher education. And we've pretty much achieved that goal. But when he stated that, it was only 10%. So, you know, it was much more self-selecting then. It's not as self-selecting now, it's a norm. And people feel pressured to go to university, whereas before it was, I want to go to university. And yet, and there was also the issue of opportunity. I mean, there was less opportunity to get to university, and what's happened is created more opportunity for people. But we're also, I mean, I know this from my children, my grandchildren, that in a lot of schools, there is a pressure to go to university. You know, you've got to get to university, and sometimes that's derived from the school wanting its best figures. You know, we want to show that 80% of our students go to university. So there's kind of a subtle pressure on young people that you've got to go to university. It's not necessarily always the right way to do it, and it creates pressure and stressors for people. It's a wider issue than just mental toughness and mental sensitivity, but understanding somebody's mental toughness and mental sensitivity does tell us how to deal with the pressures that that young person might be under.
Fantastic, Doug. There are some brilliant questions coming through, and we're running very short of time, probably a minute or two to go. So I'm just going to pick one that I think you might be able to answer reasonably quickly. So Donna Brown is asking, can you have strengths in some of the mental toughness areas and weaknesses in others?
Brilliant question. It's one of the things that is influencing what we do at the moment more than anything else. So this is a real live example, and it's actually a fairly current example. This is a mental toughness profile for a middle stroke senior leader in a big international business who has generally been successful without any real problems. This is the individual who had a team, a really good team. He'd built a team over a long period of time, great relationships with the team. He and the team were high performers. Along comes COVID-19, the team's scattered, everybody's working from home, and he is suddenly struggling. And he's struggling not only because of the dispersal, but because the organization is, I'm trying to not to give away who the organization is. They have suddenly won a large number of government contracts, and they've got to deliver a lot more than they would normally have to deliver. So under pressure in a number of ways. So we look at this and we say, this person's got an overall mental toughness score of 7. And the question there, is this person mentally tough or mentally sensitive? Now, most people say, oh, mentally tough. But that's not actually accurate, because what we can see when we look at the factors, and this is the importance of the work that has enabled us to understand mental toughness at that factorial level is that we can see on 6 of those factors, that person is distinctly mentally tough. On 2 of the factors, this person is mentally sensitive. And when we work with the mental toughness concept and the measure, this is much more common than we would expect. It is pretty much, this is probably more normal. You know, people have these little extremes or little kinks in their profile. In normal times, this individual doesn't have a problem because, yes, they react emotionally and they show their emotions, but the team deals with it. You know, because the team's got used to it, and the relationships in the team built on this person's confidence and their interpersonal confidence enables them for this to not be a particular issue for them. And the learning orientation, that largely sits within the team. So when things happen, the team kind of says, well, what happened? Let's extract the learning from it, and then they share it with the boss. So the boss doesn't have to be the person who does all the learning, the team can do it. Now this person is disconnected from his team. So he's sat in a house by himself and his emotions kick in. It's nowhere. He just allows his emotions to overcome him. He has nobody to help him moderate his emotional responses. Events are occurring and he is again slightly disconnected from the team, and so he isn't getting the kind of feedback from his team that helps him to deal with a low level of learning orientation. This person is suddenly feeling the heat, suddenly struggling, and this is a person who in December was a high performer. And so what we know is it's very rarely useful to talk about somebody's mental toughness and mental sensitivity. We are actually working with a really interesting character at the moment who is generally mentally sensitive, but has an interpersonal confidence score of 10. So we also see the reverse of this, of what you see on screen. What is important is understanding the individual's profile, understanding where their sensitivities lie and where their mental toughness lies. Mental toughness and and it's, you know, talking about mental sensitivity is a useful concept, but that's the trouble with a lot of concepts. They are very high level concepts and they need to be understood at a level where practitioners can use them. So this is what we've been able to do with this sort of concept. We've been able to operationalize mental toughness, and we've been able to get it down to a level of understanding that people can use. And when you think about, I mean, I think when we came over to Australia, you probably remember John challenging the idea that you could have 16 different types of people. There aren't 16 different types of people. There are thousands of different types of people. And this kind of profile and this kind of analysis and this kind of detail allows you to get to those thousands of different types of people. So that's a really great question, because if there's anything that we've learned, you know, a lot of the research behind developing the 8 factors is something that I've been personally very involved in. I'm hoping that in due course we get a PhD for this, but the consequence of understanding this level of detail, the factors, has led us to understand exactly the points the questioner was making, that perhaps there's no such thing as there is such a thing as mental toughness and mental sensitivity, but it's not as useful a concept for practitioners as understanding the concept in this kind of detail. This is the important bit.
Fantastic, Doug. And I think we should say that's for those who don't know, that's the MTQ Plus dashboard, isn't it? That's the level of information that you would get on an MTQ Plus measure and report.
Yeah.
So Doug, thank you. We've run over time, unfortunately, so if I can just draw everything to a close, sadly. But thank you to everybody who's tuned in for joining us today. I hope you found it as interesting as we did. If we haven't answered your questions, and there's quite a few unanswered, we'll do so over the next few days. If you're interested in mental toughness and how to measure it and develop it and some of the concepts that Doug's talked about today, please contact either Leah, Steve or myself, and we'd be obviously happy to help you in terms of developing mental toughness for yourself or your organisation. So thank you to Leah, Steve, Claudine for managing the call, and then just a huge thank you to the star of the show, Doug Strycharczyk. So thank you, Doug. That was a special presentation as always, and I hope you have a good day today. Thank you, everybody.